Hi everyone, welcome to the February 26th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. We unfortunately had to skip the TimeformUS Pacecast earlier this week, recapping last weekend's races. Maybe we'll get to those when we do the Pacecast next week if there's anything of note from last week to talk about, though. I thought there was a pretty lull in the racing calendar last weekend. Unless you were really interested in the Saudi Cup card, there wasn't too much going on stateside. I think this weekend upcoming, there's a whole lot more to sink your teeth into, and we're going to do just that at Gulfstream Park this Saturday. We're going to be focusing on this show on handicapping the latter half of Gulfstream Park's Saturday card, races 8 through 14, culminating with that final race of the day, the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth, one of the top Derby preps, offering 50 qualifying points towards the winner of that race. But they've got a stakes-laden card throughout the day on Saturday. We'll talk about the last 7 races on the card, 6 of which are stakes races that incorporates the entire Rainbow Six sequence, the entire Late Pick 5 sequence, so plenty of multi-race sequences that are part of these races to talk about. There's also the Southwest Stakes taking place at Oaklawn Park on Saturday. I know that Craig and I didn't find that the most interesting race from a betting perspective, but we will talk about it briefly just in terms of the 2 top 2-year-olds from last year making their 3-year-old debuts here. But Craig, a lot going on this weekend. Those 2 Derby preps will garner a lot of the interest, obviously, with Essential Quality and Jackie's Warrior running at Oaklawn, and also Greatest Honor, who I know is towards the top of many people's Derby lists, competing in the Fountain of Youth.
Yeah, it's quite the change from last week. As you said, there wasn't a whole lot of top-level racing last weekend, but this week we're inundated with a kind of a backlog at Oaklawn due to the weather, and this was a planned day at Gulfstream. I think there's 8 stakes on the card, or 8 graded. I lost track, and even there's a good 3-year-old maiden race, some good allowance races, one we're going to talk about. So just a really nice card of racing, and I agree. I think this was the one I'll be focused the most on. Though, as you mentioned, there are some races at Oaklawn of note, and you failed to mention Mr. Buff is running earlier in the day at Aqueduct, which won't be the greatest betting race, but he's always a fun watch.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to him galloping to an easy victory at about 2-5. But as you said, not a race to really bet. Perhaps not another race to really bet is the Southwest Stakes, where we'll start things. I don't have a whole lot to say about this race. I'm interested to hear if you have a take on it. It looks like the 2 big players to me, and Jackie's Warrior, who I was just a big fan of last year, and I still think is the most talented 2-year-old that we saw last year. Obviously, things didn't go quite right for him with regard to the pace in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, but I think he's going to be pretty tough to beat, even as he faces the Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner, Essential Quality here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting spot for these 2 to come back and actually face each other, in which just a Grade 3 race. It does have a huge purse, of course, being at Oaklawn, $750,000. So I agree with you. I mean, I think Jackie's Warrior ran very well in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and some would even argue that better than the winner, Essential Quality. So in this spot, it sure looks to me like he's going to have things his own way. There doesn't look to be a whole lot of speed, so I think he's going to be very tough to beat. There was a time in my day of following horse racing when horses like this came back early in the season. You might want to try to take a shot against them, thinking they weren't going to be fully cranked up, but I think those days have long passed. We'll talk about it a little bit with some of the races at Gulfstream as well, but for the most part, when these top-level horses come back, they're ready to roll.
Yeah, and I will note I did some in-depth videos on both of these Derby preps, the Southwest and the Fountain of Youth, which you can find on DRF.com or DRF's YouTube channel. And I kind of talk about that layoff situation a little bit. Steve Asmussen actually has a fantastic statistic with horses coming off layoffs like this in graded stakes. So I think Jackie's Warrior is going to be just fine. And I don't really view him as a Derby horse per se, but I think in races going up to a mile and a 16th, he's going to be pretty dangerous, and his pace advantage obviously is going to make him tough to catch. Nothing against Essential Quality. I just feel like maybe the roles will reverse down the line, but on this day, Jackie's Warrior might have the advantage.
Yeah, the one note I would make is Spielberg showing up here, which is not that big. I don't think he has much of a chance in here, but I do like seeing that we're going to get an early season comparison to some of that California form to some of the other form we've seen. Sometimes we have to wait a little bit longer, so I'll be interested to see how he runs.
All right, let's move right over to Gulfstream Park where they've got that stacked 14 race card. We're going to talk about the last half of that card, races 8 through 14, 7 races, 6 of them stakes races, beginning with race 8, the Canadian Turf, a grade 3 event going a mile and a 16th. This one is not part of the Rainbow 6 or the Late Pick 5 sequence, but still, nevertheless, it's an interesting competitive race to talk about, and we've gotten no real clear favorite on the morning line. We've got a couple horses coming out of a high-level allowance race that did well, Olympic Runner and Winter's Back. And we've also got Eons, who's coming out of a pretty nice effort when he was second last time out in the Tampa Bay Stakes behind the impressive Got Smokin'. I think all of these horses are pretty interesting. The pace, though, could have something to do with the outcome here.
Yeah, the pace projector has it as a fast pace. We have 3 horses shown right up on the lead. The one Busy Channel, the 3-gear jockey, and the 9 Withers Back, who is one of those favorites out of the allowance race that you mentioned. And it's hard to really argue. I don't know that the 9 has to have the lead or any of them really, except maybe the one who always seems to be up front. But I do think they all do their best running up front. So I'm not going to argue with the pace projector too much in here. And I think it's a race where I just want to look for some value. As you mentioned, Olympic Runner and Winter's Back are both coming out of that strong non-winners of 2 allowance, but they don't have any particular speed edge on the field. They're moving up in class. So they're horses I'm going to try to beat, particularly Winter's Back, since he figures to be part of that pace and he's drawn outside. And I think the logical horse is Eons, one that you mentioned, who's coming out of that grade 3 Tampa Bay Stakes, where he ran into the really tough Get Smokin'. He ran a 1:16 Timeform US speed figure, which in essence is pretty much what he runs every single time out. But this is a little bit of class relief, I think, from a lot of his races. It's similar to his last, where he was just beaten 3/4 of a length. So I do give him a big shot in here. He gets Irad Ortiz, which, as we know in turf routes, is always a pretty good sign. He usually makes the right decisions. So for me, he is the one to beat. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if he actually winds up being the favorite in this race. But I'm going to go a little bit different direction because of the pace for my top pick, and that's a little further outside to Monarch's Glen. A few things to like about him. He has the best late pace rating on Timeform US ratings in a race where we think the pace is going to be hot. He has speed figures which fit just nicely in this field with the 2 favorites I mentioned. And he is changing barns to Safi Joseph, who is first time off the claim. He does great first time off the claim, but I'll be clear, that's not the main reason I'm picking the horse, because he is coming out of the Danny Gargan barn, and he's a guy that does well with these types too. So I don't know how much room there is to go up, but if there's a little bit, I think it could help for sure. And I just think he's a horse that's logical in this spot and will offer some value.
Yeah, we have a pretty similar take on the logical horses in this race. I wasn't thrilled with the horses coming out of that nominators of 2 allowance race. Olympic Runner, obviously he's got back class from last year at Woodbine. I mean, he was 4th in the Woodbine Mile, and you could even argue that while he sprinted a lot in his career, his best races have come going a mile, so a mile and a 16th might not be a big problem for him, even though he hasn't gone that far that much in his career. So I think Olympic Runner makes sense here, but he does have that style where he comes from far back, and he got pace to close into last time. We'll see how much pace he gets here. I agree that the pace, while the projectors is predicting a fast pace, I think there's just one real need the lead type horse, so it'll be interesting to see who decides to press him. I do think of those logical runners, Eons makes the most sense. I agree he could be the favorite in this race. I kind of think he should be the favorite. He is getting that minor class release from the Tampa Bay Stakes last time, and while he hasn't won since the summer of 2019, he's been in some tough spots since then. He's been big prices on a few occasions, and I just think he's finding himself in the right kind of spots, and he seems like he's in top form right now. So Eons just seems like the right horse to me. Though I'm not going to knock your pick, Monarch's Glen. He's another closer in this race, and we talked about his last race when Danceteria came back in a stakes race in the fairgrounds a couple weeks ago. Now, Danceteria didn't run well, but could just be an apples and oranges situation. But the note that I wanted to make was that while there are no pace figures in for that race, it was a race that appeared to feature at extremely slow pace, so that would have compromised Monarch's Glen. So if he can improve it all off the claim for Safi Joseph, he'll be right there. I think it's tough to improve on Danny Gargan, but he is a horse that doesn't have to improve much to be in the mix here. Moving on to race 9 at Gulfstream, over to the dirt course. This is the start of the Rainbow Six sequence. It is the Grade 2 Gulfstream Park mile, going the one-turn mile distance. And the favorite in this race is likely to be the winner of the recent Fred Hooper. That's Performer, a horse who was highly touted really since the start of his career. He's fairly lightly raced now as a 5-year-old, and he did win that race last time, but he was 4-5, and he had to work pretty hard to achieve that victory. And I think the jury's kind of out on this horse at the moment. How good is he really? Is he ever going to ascend to that Grade 1 caliber runner that a lot of us thought he might be? He's going to have to run better than last time probably to beat this field, but I do think there's a chance that he moves forward here.
Yeah, I think it's possible. For me, he's kind of an enigma because while he's won a lot of races, he's only really ran the one really fast race in the Discovery, a day we have coded as favoring speed a bit. He did beat Tax that day, who's in this field, but this year he just hasn't run all that fast. The comeback race at Belmont in the mud was his fastest race, but that was a pretty tough figure to make that day, if I remember right. I don't think there was a lot to go on. Not doubting it, but I'm just looking at his last 3 races where he's barely cracked or his last 2 where he's run a 110 and a 112. He's going to have to step up a lot to win this, and that's something I don't want to take on a favorite. So I'm going to look to the horse he was able to beat in that Discovery and Tax. I expect a pretty big run from Tax. He's an inconsistent horse. He doesn't seem to show up when they throw him in against the Wolves like they did in the Pegasus, and he ran into Nick's Go and actually made a move into what was a pretty fast pace before fading late. But he actually ran the speed figure that he ran in his return. He had run a 120 when he won the Harlan's Holiday, only dropped back a point to a 119 because of that pace bonus he got from pressing that fast pace. And other than Win the Change, who threw a real clunker last time, I just don't see a lot of speed in here to set things up. And even if he does break well, I could see Tax just sitting off of him and willingly passing him as they turn into the lane. And for me, Tax is very much the horse to beat.
Well, I'm glad we have a different take on this race because Tax is a toss for me. I don't like him at all in this race. Looking through his form since that Discovery where he did face off and get beaten by Performer, the only time that I've been impressed by him was that Harlan's Holiday that he won 2 back. And that was a day that was at Gulfstream where speed just seemed to be golden. Every horse that got to the front end or was close to the lead in the clear seemed to have a significant advantage. And some would even argue that the rail was the place to be that day, although I think it was just more of a speed bias. And Tax was able to set a moderate pace and ran off to a pretty easy victory. But he had everything go his way in that spot. And just for me, I know he's been in some tough spots, 2 of them being the Pegasus World Cup, but he just hasn't looked like the same horse to me since his 3-year-old season, except for that Harlan's Holiday when he had everything go perfectly. And Tax also, I have some real doubts about him turning back to one turn. He just strikes me as a one-paced galloping type that really does appreciate that 1.125 mile and a 16th distance around 2 turns. And while he does have tactical speed in this race, and the fact there's just one front runner to deal with might mean that he works out the right trip, I have some doubts about Tax, and he just kind of doesn't run that often, doesn't show up with his top effort that often. As you said, he's kind of inconsistent, and I'm not looking for him to rebound here at what figures to be the second choice on the line. So he's not for me. And of the 2 favorites, I strongly prefer Performer. I'm going to keep the faith with Performer a little bit and hope that he takes a step forward here. I know that I'm taking the worst of it at what figures to be a relatively short price, but if I'm playing any kind of multi-race wager, Performer is the kind of horse that I would feel relatively comfortable leaning on in this race, mostly because I think he can get the jump on a lot of the other horses that are his main competitors who appear to be deep closers. I mean, horses like Avant Garde and Eye of the Jedi, as well as Fat Man, who raced against him last time, they don't have as much tactical speed as Performer does. And then you've got Fearless coming off the long layoff, who I think based on raw talent could have a say in this race, but he lost all of his speed the last time we saw him, so I don't know what we're going to get from Fearless off the layoff. So just a lot of question marks with regard to form and also with regard to how this race is going to be run. So I just trust and prefer Performer to work out the right trip.
Yeah, I mean, I have no argument with that. I think for me, it came down to those two, so I went with the better price because I just couldn't find anybody else I wanted to latch on to. As you mentioned, Fearless, this is what he just completely lost all his speed. I mean, he ran some pretty decent races. He was up against a pretty slow pace when Tom's d'Etat won that Foster, but he's just not a horse I'm interested in at this 1 turn mile when he's probably going to be a million lengths behind trying to catch horses into a slow pace. So it'll be an interesting race. I always look forward to these older horse races because they're when we're most likely to see somebody pop a big speed figure. I'm not sure we'd see it here, but I'd admit if one did happen, I would think it would be Performer. I'm just more skeptical that he really has it in him.
Now, the late pick 5 sequence at Gulfstream Park kicks off with race 10, which is one of the few non-stakes races on this card, though it's still a high-quality race, an optional claiming 62,500 optional tag, also for horses that have not won 2 races other than. And it's a pretty competitive field going a mile and a 16th on the turf race. Definitely a difficult race to begin this sequence. And we've got some horses coming out of that same allowance race that we just talked about in the stakes a couple races ago that was won by Olympic Runner, where Winter's Back was second. They're both opting for the stakes race, but we've got a few horses that finished behind them that are likely to be short prices in this spot, topped by Opry, the number 2 in this race. He's a closer who got a rail trip in that race and I thought had his chance in the stretch, just couldn't quite get it done. This is probably a slightly easier spot, but it's still a very competitive race.
Yeah, this is. I mean, if you just look at the speed figures in a race like this and compare it to the grade 3 that we talked about earlier, the Canadian, they're not all that far apart, particularly for the better horses. I mean, you could easily see horses switching places and running about the same. I think they're very similar. The pace projector has this as a fast-paced race. I think this one's really tricky. We have a horse like Syaf coming in who's basically been running in turf sprints for forever. Up near the lead, so almost for sure you would think he's got to go. And then you have a horse like Al Mashriq who's been running in dirt sprints as of late and 1-turn dirt miles, showing some speed. So if he were to show up in here, it would be his first try on the grass since he shipped to North America. You know, you would have to expect he's part of the pace. So there is, I do think, a decent amount of speed in here that could set it up. And that makes it a little tricky for the horse that I like in here. And that's the 8-horse Bodie Cream. He's coming out of just a listed stakes race at the fairgrounds where he lost to Pixelate. It was still a 3-year-old race at the time. They're all 4-year-olds now. And he's a horse who's a little tricky on the pace projector because, unfortunately, he's ran into situations where we weren't able to make pace figures for him, I think, in 3 of his last 4 races, and that's when he's shown more speed. So he's shown shuffled back pretty far in the pace projector, but this is one of those times where I think you got to use your own handicapping judgment. I think he'll be close up, and I just think he's a horse who's set to run a big race. I like that he's a newly turned 4-year-old. His speed figures fit well. I do think he's getting some class relief from the horses he's faced in graded stakes before. And I'm looking for a big race from him for Mike Maker.
Yeah, I have no problem with Bodie Cream. I think he's a major player in this race, and the fact that he was close to the pace in some of his recent starts, I think that's just the way that those races played out. There wasn't a whole lot of speed going on in those races, and I think he got some savvy rides because he does have a versatile running style, and they elected to have him closer to the pace, but he's run fine coming from farther back in the past, so if things do heat up on the front end, I don't see him as being a horse that's compromised, so I just think he makes a lot of sense in this race. As for the other short price, I'm not really against Opry. I just think he hasn't really improved that much since all the way back in 2019. He kind of runs by appointment only. And like I said, I thought he had his chance last time against that tougher field, came through on the inside, and it didn't really have an answer in the very late stages. So I was iffy on him. The horse that I landed on here is the number 9, Street Ready, who's coming off a layoff for Ian Wilkes. This horse, you might remember when he was a 3-year-old last year. He had a few tough trips, one in particular on April 19th when he won. He was extremely extremely wide around the turns and somehow won that race despite losing all that ground. He tried a tough field in the war chant after that, and he came back in the Transylvania in his most recent start, most recent being last July. As I said, he's coming off a layoff. But the last time that we saw him, I thought he ran extremely well. He got a good trip in that Transylvania, but he just lost a heartbreaking head bob to Field Past, who's a good horse. And those behind him, like Fancy Liquor and City Man, they've both proven to be turf stakes horses since then. So I just think Street Ready is a little better than his speed figures make it seem. And if he's taken a step forward at all, turning 3 to 4 now, I think he could be dangerous for Ian Wilkes coming off the layoff.
Yeah, I don't have much to add about him other than to say he would be my second pick in the race. I'm expecting a big race from him. Ian Wilkes does just fine off the layoff, so I don't think that's much of a concern. And as you say, you got to be careful in these spots with the speed figures. He ran a 113 last out. But, if he comes back bigger, stronger, that could easily turn into a 120 first start as a 4-year-old, because we're talking almost 8 months later. So it's just something to keep in mind when you look at these horses who haven't raced in a while and are still pretty young.
Yeah, that's a good point. These horses can definitely move forward. I think it's just a matter of whether or not they're ready off the layoff. Moving on to race 11, which does begin the late pick 4 sequence, the second leg of the pick 5 sequence at Gulfstream. It is the grade 3 Honey Fox going a mile for the fillies and mares. And we've got a standout from a class perspective in this race, and that is the number 2 Got Stormy, who figures to be a heavy favorite. But she does have a question to answer as she comes off a layoff and makes her 6-year-old debut here, because they had turned her back to be a turf sprinter at the end of last year, and it seemed like that had gotten her back on track, and she was getting back into top form as a turf sprinter. Now they're stretching back out to a mile, which she had certainly been proficient at in the past. But if you go back to the beginning of last year, she was having some trouble finishing off these route races. Now, this is some big class relief for her, so clearly she might be able to not run her A race and beat this field. But I do think at a short price, Got Stormy is a horse that you can't just trust on faith alone.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I doubt I'm going to play horizontals on this day, mostly because of the 3-year-old races we're going to talk about going forward. And I wouldn't know what to do with Got Stormy in here if I did, because it almost feels like, to me, she's the kind of horse you either single or you don't use, because otherwise you're just going to kill any value that you really have. My plan on Saturday is to just take a shot against her in verticals. It's still pretty fresh in my mind for some reason, the real clunker she threw off in her debut last year at Tampa, where I think she went off at 1-5 and didn't even hit the board. I still remember, as you said, she really had problems at the mile and a little bit longer distances last year. Seemed to find her form when she turned back to sprints, but I'm almost wondering if that was just that, the horses in the sprints just aren't as good, because she was basically running the same speed figures, but instead of finishing 4th or 5th, she was suddenly winning races again. So I don't love her in here. I mean, maybe she'll win, maybe not. I do think you have to keep an eye on the pace. Jakarta's entered in this race. Who knows if she's going to go? I know we've talked about her many times. I can't even remember how many times she's been entered in these turf routes, and she never actually seems to make it to the gate. So hard for me to say what's going on with her. And if she doesn't run, maybe Get Stormy shows up and is lone speed and there's nobody else to go with her. But I'm going to go in a different direction. The horse I like the most is Feel Glorious. She's a horse who I think excels in these situations where there's not a lot of pace. Even though she's a closer, I think she's the kind that likes to be in a race without much pace and just outkick horses home. And I think that's the exact scenario she's going to get here. So she'll be my top pick.
Yeah, I do think this is an opportunity to take a small shot against Got Stormy at a short price. Like you, if I'm playing a multi-race wager, I would not exclude Got Stormy. I think that she definitely is a horse that you have to use in those wagers, but I would have some backups, even if she's more of an A type and the others are Bs. Though I would place Zofel as a real rival for her. Zofel has faced weaker company, and while she was visually impressive in winning that Marshalls River last time, I mean, Sweet By and Bellora, they're not on the same level as Got Stormy is, but I think Zofel has always shown the kind of potential to be able to ascend to this level, and she's had some stops and starts in her career. She's had some poor trips that haven't allowed her to show her true ability, but I think Zofel might work out the right trip here, because while she has come from far back in a few of her races, she has more tactical speed than her past performances would belie. And last time out, she was traveling very handily. She moved into the race without really being asked under Tyler Gaffalione, and I just thought that was a nice starting point for her. And now second off the layoff, I think she can move forward. And for me, she's the main rival to Got Stormy. Nothing against your pick, Feel Glorious, who I've liked in the past, and I think she's an admirable performer. I just think we know what we're going to get from her, and she'd probably need Got Stormy not to show up, whereas I think Zofel might have room for improvement still, so I'd lean more in that direction, but I'll be very surprised if one of these three doesn't win the race.
Yeah, I do have a little bit of interest if I'm playing exotics in Rachetta, I guess is how you say it, for Bill Mott. She only ran once in this country. She kind of had a tough trip, didn't break well. She was bet, but did very little running. But obviously, I think something went wrong that day. We haven't seen her since. That was back in August. She's been working really well since, and she's one at a price I would probably try to get in exactas with Zofel and Feel Glorious.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I think about her. That Saratoga Oaks last year was an extremely weak race for a race of that level with a $500,000 purse. And I wouldn't even say she was bet that much to be 7-2 in that race. I just think that speaks to the quality of the field. And I looking at her European form, I even remember last summer thinking that she hadn't faced that much over there. So I don't know. Maybe she steps forward as a 4-year-old, but I didn't see her as quite having this kind of potential. We'll see though. Moving on to race 12 at Gulfstream, it is the Davona Dale Stakes Grade 2 event, going a mile for the 3-year-old fillies, this being a prep for the Kentucky Oaks. And a filly that we're likely to see in the Kentucky Oaks come a few months' time is Vequist, who was last year's 2-year-old champion filly, winner of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. This is just a starting off point for her, so she's probably not cranked up to put forth her A effort off the layoff, but she probably won't need to, because this is not the toughest field that she's faced in her career.
No, for sure. And this is one of those races where I just have a hard time coming up with anybody to beat her. She is just faster than these, assuming she's in even the same form she was as a 2-year-old. She shouldn't really have any problems. I like that she ran well first time out as a first-time starter at Parks. So I don't think there's doubts that she can run off the bench. She's already done it a little bit, even though she didn't win that day. She certainly ran pretty well, and I just think she was her and the horse who beat her, who's
Day Out of the Office.
Yeah, Day Out of the Office. We're just so much faster than everybody last year. I just think she towers over the field and is going to be tough to beat. I guess her main competition would be Crazy Beautiful, who also comes out of that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. But admittedly, she wasn't much competition that day. And then we have Milfoy. Did I say that right? I can't remember how you pronounce it.
I think you got it right.
All right, I thought so. I remember we talked about the baking show, the Great British Bake Off. Right? Isn't that how you learned how to pronounce that, I believe?
Yes, I believe Milfoy is like a Napoleon. It's got a lot of flaky layers of pastry.
Right. But she's the one I would probably be against a bit in here. She just hasn't run all that. I mean, she hasn't run near fast enough. Certainly she has some room to improve being by Curlin out of a War Front mare, but I'm not sure the 1-turn mile is where we're really going to see it. I was a little disappointed in her last race, but I'm not holding it against her too much. I just don't think this is a perfect spot for her.
Yeah, I have nothing against Vequist. I think she makes a lot of sense in this race. She did get a great trip to win the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, and perhaps trips had something to do with the result of that race, but like you said, she's been very fast, really from her second career start when she won the Spinaway. Her last 3 performances as a 2-year-old filly were just they were just exceptional. And she comes into this race really not having to improve at all off the layoff, and she could even take a slight step back and probably still beat this field. And the one-turn mile, it seems like it's absolutely perfect for her. She is shown as the leader in a pace projector that's predicting a fast pace, and there are plenty of stretch-out sprinters in here. Still, I'm not too concerned about it. She's not a need-the-lead type. She's totally content to stalk, so I'm not really worried about her trip. She just seems like the best horse in here, though I am very interested in that horse that we were just talking about, the pronunciation of her name, Milfoy. She seemed like she was coming along at the end of last year. I did like her performance in the Demoiselle. As time goes on, it does seem like the rail probably wasn't the place to be on that Cigar Mile card, and she did spend a bit of time on the rail and drifted down there at the end of that race. Just got a little tired at the end of the mile and an eighth. But I've watched a couple of her workouts coming back off the layoff for Bill Mott, and I've been pretty impressed. It seems like she's one of these 3-year-olds that's really taken a step forward during the winter, the time away. She's been very aggressive in her training, and I'm expecting we're going to see an improvement from Milfoy off the break. She'd have to improve quite a bit to beat Vequist, but I think she's the alternative that you want to turn to rather than Crazy Beautiful, who had a lot of chances as a 2-year-old, kind of plateaued at the end of the year, really was no match for the best in the country like Vequist and the juvenile filly. So I don't see her turning the tables. I think if there's a horse that's going to pose a real threat to Vequist and perhaps stage an upset, it's Milfoy. And I'd actually lean towards her and make her my top pick just as a likely value play in this race.
Yeah, I probably said that wrong as well. I'm not trying to beat Vequist. I just didn't see Milfoy doing it at this point in time. Maybe later down the line, but she's certainly going to offer the value. She's probably going to be 4 or 5 times the price. So I have no real argument with that. I said Crazy Beautiful is probably the main competition. That's just based on the odds. I don't particularly think she's really a threat to Vequist.
Moving on to race 13, the penultimate race at Gulfstream. It is the very one grade 3 event going 1 mile and 3/16 on the turf for the fillies and mares. And before things get a little easier in the Fountain of Youth, they certainly get difficult in this very one, which I think is one of the toughest races to handicap in this entire sequence. It's hard to know where to start. It's a very competitive field. Chad Brown's got a couple of entrants. I think the slight morning line favorite is his European shipper, California Queen. Not really sure what to make of her off the layoff and making her first start in the U.S., but the others that are based in this country are coming from a multitude of directions, some stretching out, some turning back in distance. Where do you want to begin, Craig? Because I had trouble making sense of this race.
Yeah, this is a really tough one, and it's a case, I think you always want to start with the Chad Brown horses, but in this case, I wasn't particularly blown away by either one of them. I mean, the shipper is coming in from Germany, which is fine. I mean, we've seen plenty of good horses come over from Germany, but the thing that stands out to me is the distances she's been running. They've all been much, much further, including the last couple where she ran 1 mile and 3/4 and 1 mile and 7/8. Just doesn't look like she has much speed at all, and it's hard for me to finding a trip on this Gulfstream course where that's favorable. So not really interested in her. The one upside, I guess, for the other Chad Brown, Bacchanalia, is that she draws Irad Ortiz. But looking at her past performances and her speed figures, I can't get too excited about her. It's also taken him quite a while to even get her to run in a stakes race, which tells me maybe he was a little skeptical of the talent of this one, and the speed figures kind of back that up. So I don't want to get too carried away knocking in a horse who might be 8-1, is 8-1 on the morning line, ridden by Irad Ortiz and Chad Brown. But I suspect this one will get bet down a little bit. So that said, I've been a little hesitant to do this because I know you're going to hate this pick, but I'm actually going with Antoinette in here because we already mentioned that race where she had won at Saratoga earlier. But it's just a pace thing for me. I actually think she's not too bad. Those weren't the best fields in the world, but she was running 110 plus TimeformUS speed figures back in August and September. She didn't run very well in that Valley View or run well at all, but she's had some time off. Bill Mott's been hot, and I just don't see a lot of speed in here. I think she can either be right on the front again or maybe tracking the 2-horse who we show a little bit in front of her, Bellara. And I think she's going to get a perfect trip, so she's going to need some improvement, but she's the one for me.
Well, you know that I can't possibly pick Antoinette, so there's not going to be too much love for her on this podcast. I'm just not her biggest fan. I totally hear you with regard to the speed figures from last year, and she is turning 4 now, so I suppose she can improve. But I'm just not thrilled with the quality of the races that she was in last year. I thought they campaigned her very wisely by running in those races and taking advantage of some weak spots, but I'm not going to upgrade her based on her performances in races where I just thought she was facing inferior competition. So she's not for me. I'm not going to be shocked if she does well because she does figure to work out a very good trip. I just am not a big fan of hers. As for those two Chad Brown horses, I don't really know what to make of them. They've been training together for whatever that's worth on the Palm Meadows course. California Queen perhaps looks a little better than Bacchanalia in the mornings, but Bacchanalia is a horse that can be very difficult to train and also difficult to race. She gets extremely rank under her riders both in the mornings and the afternoons, so you never really know what kind of trip she's going to work out because she can just run off with a rider at times. So she's hard to trust. And California Queen, it's kind of funny to watch these two training together because Bacchanalia is this big burly filly and California Queen, it looks very petite, very small actually. Not that really matters with regard to athletic ability all the time, but we'll see how she does in her first start in this country. The distance should be no problem at all because she's gone longer in Europe. I just think it's a question of quality with her. So I think it remains to be seen how she does here. I'm going to go with the horse that I liked last time out in the La Prevoyante, and that's the number 10, Sister Hanan. I took a shot that she would handle the 1.5 miles last time. I don't think she did badly at that distance. I also don't think 1.5 miles is going to be her favorite distance moving forward. I think getting back to 3/16 is really preferred for her, and I liked her return from the layoff 2 back when she won that allowance race. I thought she had shown real quality going back to the winter of 2020, winning a couple races and finishing third actually in the Honey Fox, which is being run also on this card. Last year, I thought she ran very well there behind Get Mother a Rose. And Sister Hanan just feels like the kind of horse that's now finally gaining some momentum in her third start off the layoff. So I expect her to put forth a good effort here. And I'm hoping that's good enough to take enough of a step forward to beat a horse like Antoinette. But there are many other ways to go in here. I mean, what do you do with a horse like Warlike Goddess, who's undefeated in her career, was certainly visually impressive last year at Churchill Downs. I'm just not sure what she was beating in those races.
Yeah, those are always the tough kind. I mean, she's been off a while, but I mean, it hasn't been that long, 4 months. She's 2 for 2. She has to improve, but it's a race where I do think you have to watch the board. I do like your horse, Sister Anon. I think she's going to run well. She's going to have to work out a trip from outside. But if there's one thing we usually count on with Corey Lannery, it's that he's going to try to save ground and hope to get through. So if there is some kind of pace, he is likely to make that one out and make a trip from there. And though I wouldn't even dismiss the 2-horse Bella Laura just because there's not a lot of speed in here. I mentioned the Antoinette, and she's basically it. She's not even a front runner, but she has went wire to wire. She sat off the pace, but given that inside draw and the lack of speed, it's almost hard for me to see her not getting a good trip.
No, that's a good point about Belle Laura. I kind of glossed over her a little bit when I first went through this race, but coming back to it, she does figure to get the right kind of trip in a race that doesn't feature a ton of speed, and she does have some big races from Gulfstream last year that would make her competitive here. So she's definitely not my top pick, but she's one that I could see using underneath or perhaps as a backup in a pick 5 kind of wager. Moving on to the final race of the day at Gulfstream on Saturday, or the final race we're going to discuss on this podcast. It is that Derby Prep, the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth, going 1 mile and 16th with that short stretch and the early finish line at Gulfstream Park. And we're going to have a heavy favorite in here in all likelihood with Greatest Honor, who I know a lot of people like for the Kentucky Derby as he continues progressing for Shug McGahee. This will be his second real test of the winter after winning the Holy Bull last time by nearly 6 lengths. And he's not facing a field that looks that much tougher than the one that he met in the Holy Bull. So I think it's arguable that he doesn't have to improve that much to win this race. And to me, while I don't love the default to short prices, it looks pretty tough to beat this colt.
Yeah, I would be shocked if anybody... I can only see 2 horses winning this race. One is Greatest Honor, and the other would be Fire at Will if he somehow handles the dirt. And I'm pretty skeptical of that happening. I mean, I know he won it on dirt in an off-the-turf race early in his career, but he did so with a really slow speed figure. When you look at his pedigree, absolutely nothing says dirt. So I would make this race probably easily 75%, maybe more, for Greatest Honor to win. That 9-5 morning line has to be a pipe dream. There's no way he's going to be anywhere near that. I'd be shocked if he's even money even. I think he's going to be below that. So I just think he's really tough to beat. Not a whole lot of other horses showed up. Maybe if I was going to give one other horse a slight chance, it would be to the inside, Drain the Clock. If he could somehow break well from that inside post, which we know is a really big advantage at this mile and a 16th distance. But he's a horse that, just watching him, has screamed sprinter to me from the first time I've seen him. I get why they're taking a shot with him. And if he's ever going to steal a race, this would be the time to do it. But as you said, Greatest Honor, he won by almost 6 lengths last time. And he's facing arguably the same competition. I mean, it's just no new shooters other than the turf horse at all. So I'll probably just be watching this one and see what happens, not betting it. But I think he's going to be super tough to beat.
And I've seen some chatter on Twitter that people are afraid of a bounce with Greatest Honor. I mean, number one, I don't really believe in the bounce theory that much. And number two, I mean, if he's going to bounce off the kind of race that he ran last time, then a lot of horses are supposed to bounce. I just think he showed natural improvement in the Holy Bull victory. He had run very well in his maiden win prior to that, and he's just coming along the way that a lot of Shug McGaughey horses do. Once the light bulb goes on, they just continue improving. And I was looking through Formulator, and I found a stat that applies to this exact situation with 3-year-olds that won their last starts in dirt route graded stakes for Shug. He's 6 for 10 over the past 5 years. Actually, another one lost by a neck, so he's almost 7 for 10 with an ROI that's over $4. I don't care about the ROI because Greatest Honor is going to be a short price, but I just think that kind of it kind of contradicts that bounce theory a little bit with a horse like this. So he just makes too much sense to me. And like you, I didn't see too many other places to go here, frankly. For the horses that I would use underneath him, I was mostly going back to the horses coming out of the Holy Bull. I'm not convinced by Drain the Clock or Fire at Will for the same reasons that you outlined. And I'd be most interested in horses like Tarantino and Papatoo to use underneath because they both figure to be decent prices once again. And I thought Tarantino ran fine last time in the Holy Bull, his first start on the dirt. And Papatoo just always seems to be right there and doesn't get a lot of respect. So I'd use them underneath rather than a horse like Prime Factor, who I thought was disappointing last time and could get overbet again. But to me, on the win end, this just seemed pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I do like the rider change on Papatoo, which will lead me, if I do play some verticals, I would definitely use him. I thought he was pretty tentatively ridden last time. He should have been a bit closer up. I think he was my pick, if I remember right. Not that he was ever winning, but I think he could have run better than what he showed. I will touch on the bounce thing a little bit. I believe in the bounce in very limited situations. It's generally when a horse runs big off a long layoff. I usually expect a little bit of a regression, but not for a horse like Greatest Honor, who's just racing right along, moving, progressing as he should as a 3-year-old. I don't believe in horses just bouncing only because they ran a fast race. I would need to see something else, and he's actually the exact kind of horse I would not expect to bounce from. I would expect him to keep moving right on forward. I do still think he's got some ways to go. I know a lot of people are really high on him on the Derby trail, and it's pretty early to get too deep into that, but he's got some room to go on the speed figure scale to catch some of the better horses we've seen. So at this point in time, I'm not as high on him as a true Derby contender as I am some others.
Yeah, I think we have the same view on that. He's got a long way to go to make it to the Derby or to make it into the starting gate as one of the favorites in the Derby. But given the way this race came up, his stock just figures to rise coming out of here. So we'll see what happens when we recap this race next week. As for pick 5 strategy or whatever multi-race bets you're looking at, it's not an easy sequence, but I think there are some races you can lean on. You've got Stormy in the sequence. You've got Greatest Honor in the sequence. So if you do want to spread in a race like the very one, I think there are opportunities to do so.
Yeah, if I'm going to play a pick 5, which admittedly I probably won't, I would be singling the 2 3-year-old races and spreading any others. Probably not use Got Stormy, because if the 2 heavy favorites and Got Stormy win, then there's no value. It's all gone. I mean, unless I got two absolute bombs, which I don't see coming. So that would be my strategy if I played it. I will have to keep an eye on scratches because I do think there are some potential changes to these races that could always affect your thinking. But for now, I'm looking for some verticals more than playing horizontals.
Yeah, we have a similar view on that. I think you can, if you play a pick five sequence, you can do so relatively thinly, or you can try to beat some of those favorites and go for a bigger ticket. But as we said, I wouldn't take a big stand against a lot of these favorites. Maybe Got Stormy a little bit, and perhaps even VQuist. I'd use one other alternative, but I don't think those are races that you want to go too deep in when you can spread in some other ones. Well, that's it for the handicapping on this TimeformUS forecast. I do think we plan to be back for the TimeformUS Pacecast next Tuesday, and we should have plenty to recap with all of the stakes going on at Gulfstream as well as at Oaklawn Park, those Saturday and Sunday stakes taking place in Arkansas. So there should be plenty to look back on when we record that TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday. For now, remember, you can always listen to us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and look out for that TimeformUS Pacecast on Tuesday.